Imagine being torn from your family at age 8, forced to convert to a foreign religion, and trained to become the most feared warrior in the world. This wasn't fiction. This was the reality for hundreds of thousands of Christian children across the Ottoman Empire for over 4 centuries. They called it the Dev Shirm, the blood tax, and it created the most elite military force the world had ever seen, the Janissaries. But here's what will shock you. These child soldiers didn't just serve their captors. They rose to become the power behind the throne, kingmakers who could make or break sultans with a single decision. Some became grand viziers, ruling entire empires. Others became the architects of magnificent mosques that still stand today. The very system designed to destroy their identity instead gave them the keys to ultimate power. This is the untold story of how the Ottoman Empire built its greatest strength on its most controversial foundation, and how that foundation ultimately brought the empire to its knees. The year is 1453. 8-year-old Nikola sits by the fireplace in his small Serbian village, listening to his grandmother tell stories of ancient heroes. Tomorrow he'll help his father tend the sheep. Next week he'll celebrate his Saint's Day at the local Orthodox church. But Nikola doesn't know that tonight is the last night of his childhood. The last night he'll answer to that name, and the last time he'll see his family for decades, if ever. At dawn, armed horsemen wearing distinctive white felt caps ride into the village. The villagers know exactly who they are and why they've come. It's time for the Devshirme, the collection of the Sultan's human tribute. Every 4 to 5 years, these recruiters sweep through the Christian provinces of the empire, selecting the strongest, smartest, and most promising boys between the ages of 8 and 18. Today, it's Nikola's turn. The Ottoman system wasn't random violence or simple slavery. It was methodical, calculated, and terrifyingly efficient. The recruiters, called Surucu, carried detailed registers of every Christian household in their assigned territories. They knew which families had sons of the right age, which boys showed promise, and which communities had already paid their human tax. This wasn't a raid, it was a harvest. The selection process revealed the sophisticated brutality of the system. Boys who were too weak were rejected. The Ottomans had no use for soldiers who couldn't endure years of brutal training. Those who were too old had already formed strong religious and cultural identities that would be harder to break. The recruiters looked for specific qualities: physical strength, intelligence, and most importantly, malleability. They wanted boys young enough to be completely reshaped, but old enough to remember that they had been something else before. Muslim children were exempt from the Devshirme. This wasn't mercy, it was strategy. According to Islamic law, Muslim children belonged to the community of believers and couldn't be enslaved. But more than that, the Ottomans understood that converted Christians would have no tribal loyalties, no family connections, and no allegiances except to the Sultan who had given them everything. They would be the perfect servants of absolute power. Young Nikola tries to run. His mother screams. His father pleads with the recruiters, offering them money, livestock, anything to spare his son. But resistance is futile and dangerous. Families who hid their sons faced severe punishment. Villages that resisted the Devshirme could be burned to the ground. The message was clear: cooperation meant survival, defiance meant destruction. Some families, horrifyingly, began to see opportunity in this nightmare. They realized that their sons, once transformed into Janissaries, could rise higher in Ottoman society than they ever could as Christian peasants. A few even bribed the recruiters to take their boys. The system had become so powerful that it turned victims into collaborators and parents into willing participants in their children's cultural destruction. The journey to Istanbul could take weeks or months. Hundreds of boys chained together in long columns march across the empire toward their new lives. Many don't survive the journey. Disease, exhaustion, and despair claim the weak. Those who collapse are left behind. The Ottomans are interested in creating an elite force, not a charity for the unfit. During this forced march, the psychological warfare begins. The boys are given new names, Turkish or Arabic names that sever their connection to their Christian past. Nikola becomes Mehmet. His friend Stefan becomes Ahmed. Their Serbian, Bulgarian, Greek or Albanian languages are forbidden. They must speak Turkish or face punishment. Already their identities are being systematically erased. When they finally reach Istanbul, the boys face their first major selection. The most intelligent and attractive are chosen for the palace service, where they'll be trained as pages and potentially rise to become grand viziers or provincial governors. These are the lucky ones, though they don't know it yet. The majority, including our young Mehmet, are sent to Turkish farms in Anatolia for several years of agricultural work that serves as both physical conditioning and cultural immersion. This farming period is genius in its cruelty. Living with Turkish families, the boys learn the language perfectly, absorb Islamic customs, and develop emotional bonds with their Turkish families. They're not treated as slaves, but as adopted sons. This isn't kindness, it's psychological conditioning. When they're eventually taken away for military training, they've already begun to think of themselves as Turks and Muslims. The process of cultural conversion is nearly complete before formal military training even begins. The transformation from Christian peasant to Muslim warrior wasn't just about changing names and religions. The Ottomans understood that breaking someone's identity required destroying their sense of self and rebuilding it from scratch. The boys were taught that their Christian past was a life of ignorance and darkness. Islam was presented as enlightenment and service to the Sultan as the highest honor. Many began to genuinely believe this narrative, especially those taken at very young ages. After several years on Anatolian farms, the young men are ready for the next phase, formal military training. They're brought to specialized barracks in major cities across the empire, where they'll spend the next decade learning the arts of war. But this isn't just military school. It's a total institution designed to create fanatic loyalty and unquestioning obedience. The training regime is brutal beyond imagination. Days begin before dawn with prayers and continue until late at night with weapons practice, physical conditioning, and religious instruction. The recruits learn to use the composite bow, the curved sword, the musket, and later, artillery. They study siege warfare, cavalry tactics, and urban combat. But the physical training is only half the curriculum. Mental conditioning is equally important. The young men are taught that they are slaves of the Sultan, but slaves of a special kind. They are kul, elite slaves who serve the shadow of God on earth. Their slavery isn't degradation, but elevation. They have been chosen from among all the peoples of the world to serve the greatest ruler who has ever lived. This psychological framework transforms the trauma of their abduction into a sense of divine selection. Religious instruction reinforces their new identity. They memorize the Quran, learn Islamic law, and participate in Sufi mystical practices that create intense emotional bonds with their faith and their brothers. The Janissaries develop their own unique Islamic culture, with special prayers, ceremonies, and rituals that bind them together as a sacred brotherhood. Their barracks become monasteries of war, where prayer and violence intertwine in daily life. The young men also learn trades beyond warfare. Some become engineers and architects, others study medicine or law. The most intellectually gifted receive education in mathematics, astronomy, and languages. The Ottomans understand that their elite military force must also be capable administrators and builders. These skills will prove crucial as former Janissaries rise to civilian positions throughout the empire. During training, the cultural transformation becomes complete. The young men begin to look down on Christians as infidels living in spiritual darkness. They see their former lives as primitive and ignorant. Many develop genuine hatred for their birth families and communities, viewing them as obstacles to Ottoman greatness. The system has successfully turned victims into perpetrators, conquered into conquerors. But the psychological conditioning goes deeper than religious conversion. The Janissaries develop an almost mystical devotion to the Sultan personally. He isn't just their ruler, he's their father, their master, their god on earth. They swear oaths of absolute obedience and pledge to die for him without question. This personal loyalty will become both the empire's greatest strength and its fatal weakness. The training also creates intense bonds between the Janissaries themselves. Having been torn from their birth families, they form new kinship networks based on shared trauma and shared purpose. They become brothers in a way that transcends blood relationships. These bonds create unit cohesion that makes them nearly invincible on the battlefield, but also dangerously unified when they decide to rebel against authority. After a decade of training, the young men are ready to join active Janissary units. They receive their distinctive white felt caps, their ceremonial daggers, and their regimental numbers. They are no longer Christian peasant boys. They are the elite warriors of the most powerful empire on earth. But their education isn't over. Veterans will continue their practical training in warfare, politics, and administration. The new Janissaries join a military organization unlike anything else in the medieval world. The corps is organized into ortas, battalions of between 100 and 500 men, each with its own specialty, traditions, and battle honors. Some ortas specialize in archery, others in musketry or artillery. Elite units serve as the Sultan's personal bodyguards. Each orta develops fierce pride in its reputation and bitter rivalries with other units. The Janissary barracks become cities within cities. Each orta has its own mosque, kitchen, workshop, and officers' quarters. The men eat together, pray together, and live together in a communal lifestyle that reinforces their military identity. They're forbidden to marry while on active duty, ensuring that their primary loyalty remains to their military brothers and their sultan, rather than to wives and children. The discipline within the corps is harsh but fair by medieval standards. Officers are promoted based on merit rather than birth or wealth. Justice is swift and impartial. Cowardice in battle means death, but distinguished service brings rapid advancement. Many Janissaries rise to become officers within a few years, and the most exceptional can eventually leave the corps for high civilian positions. But it's on the battlefield that the Janissaries truly prove their worth. Their first major test comes during the conquest of Constantinople in 1453, where they serve as elite assault troops in the final attack on the city walls. Their discipline under fire, their willingness to die for victory, and their superior training prove decisive in one of history's most important battles. The Janissaries don't just participate in the fall of Byzantium, they make it possible. Over the following decades, Janissary units spearhead Ottoman expansion across 3 continents. They march through the gates of Belgrade and Budapest. They storm the walls of Rhodes and Cyprus. They fight Safavid Persians in the mountains of Anatolia and Mamluk armies in the deserts of Syria. Wherever the Ottoman Empire expands, Janissary discipline and firepower break enemy resistance and establish Ottoman authority. The Janissaries develop a fearsome reputation that often defeats enemies before battles even begin. European armies, accustomed to feudal levies and unreliable mercenaries, can't match the discipline and training of troops who have spent their entire adult lives preparing for war. The distinctive white caps of the Janissaries become symbols of terror across southeastern Europe. Parents frighten misbehaving children with threats that the Janissaries will come for them. But the Janissaries aren't just soldiers, they're also engineers, administrators, and builders. Janissary veterans design the siege works that reduce enemy fortresses. They survey routes for roads and aqueducts. They oversee construction projects and manage provincial finances. The skills learned during their training make them invaluable servants of imperial expansion and administration. As the empire stabilizes and expands, the Janissaries begin to enjoy privileges that set them apart from ordinary soldiers and even from much of the civilian population. They receive regular salaries paid in silver, rather than the irregular payments common to medieval armies. They enjoy tax exemptions and legal privileges. They have access to the best medical care and retirement benefits. Service in the Janissary Corps becomes not just duty, but a path to social mobility unavailable anywhere else in the medieval world. The most successful Janissaries rise far beyond military service. They become provincial governors, Supreme Court judges, and diplomatic ambassadors. Some accumulate vast wealth through trade and real estate. Others become patrons of art and architecture, commissioning magnificent buildings that still grace Istanbul and other Ottoman cities. The system designed to create military slaves instead produces a new aristocracy based on merit rather than birth. This success creates an unexpected problem. As Janissaries accumulate wealth and status, they begin to demand the right to marry and pass their positions to their sons. They establish businesses and buy property. They develop interests that extend beyond military service. The celibate warrior monks begin to transform into a hereditary military caste with family ties and economic interests to protect. The transformation accelerates during the 16th century. Janissaries start to marry despite regulations forbidding it. They use their influence to get their sons enrolled in the corps, bypassing the Devshirme system entirely. They invest in trade and manufacturing, turning military barracks into commercial centers. The institution created to serve imperial expansion begins to develop its own agenda. Meanwhile, the Devshirme system itself begins to change. As the empire stops expanding, the need for new recruits decreases. The human tribute is collected less frequently and with less rigor. Some provinces gain exemptions through political pressure or bribery. The careful selection process that once ensured only the best candidates becomes corrupted as influence and money determine who gets taken and who escapes. Christian families develop sophisticated strategies for avoiding the Devshirme. They hide their sons, bribe officials, or arrange early marriages to make boys ineligible for selection. Some communities pool resources to pay collective bribes that spare entire villages. The system that once operated with mechanical efficiency becomes increasingly arbitrary and corrupt. By the 17th century, the majority of new Janissaries aren't recruited through the Devshirme at all. They're the sons of existing Janissaries, Turkish volunteers seeking steady employment, or political appointees placed by influential patrons. The corps loses its character as converted Christian slaves and becomes instead a hereditary military caste with Turkish and Muslim roots. This transformation has profound consequences for both military effectiveness and political stability. The original Janissaries had no loyalties outside the corps and the Sultan. They could be deployed anywhere in the empire without concern that they might develop local sympathies or conflicting allegiances. But hereditary Janissaries have families to support, property to protect, and local connections that influence their behavior. The new Janissaries are also less disciplined and less motivated than their predecessors. They haven't experienced the total transformation that created fanatic loyalty to the Sultan. They see military service as a job rather than a sacred calling. They demand higher pay, better conditions, and more privileges. When these demands aren't met, they're willing to rebel against the very authority they're supposed to serve. The first major Janissary rebellion occurs in 1622, when the corps overthrows Sultan Osman II after he threatens to disband them and create a new army based on Anatolian Turkish recruitment. The Janissaries not only depose the Sultan, but execute him, demonstrating that they now see themselves as power brokers rather than servants. The slaves have become the masters. Over the following 2 centuries, Janissary rebellions become increasingly common and destructive. The corps that once made sultans now breaks them regularly. Between 1617 and 1730, Janissaries participate in the overthrow of 6 different sultans. They dictate imperial policy, veto military campaigns, and demand tribute from the treasury. The Ottoman Empire becomes hostage to its own military elite. The Janissaries also become a conservative force that resists military and administrative reforms. They oppose the introduction of new weapons and tactics that might reduce their importance. They resist changes in training, organization, and recruitment that might threaten their privileges. The corps that once embodied innovation and adaptation becomes a barrier to modernization. European military technology advances rapidly during the 17th and 18th centuries, but the Janissaries refuse to adapt. They cling to traditional weapons and tactics long after these become obsolete. Ottoman armies begin to suffer defeats against Habsburg, Russian and Persian forces equipped with more modern arms and training. The military advantage that the Janissaries once provided turns into a strategic liability. The economic burden of supporting the enlarged and increasingly privileged Janissary corps also becomes unsustainable. By the 18th century, the corps includes over 130,000 members, many of whom are involved in trade and crafts rather than active military service. They still receive military salaries while pursuing civilian occupations, creating a massive drain on imperial finances during a period of declining revenues. The Janissaries use their political power to protect their economic interests, blocking tax reforms and opposing fiscal policies that might reduce their privileges. They become a state within the state, with their own finances, legal system, and political agenda. Imperial authority erodes as Janissary power grows. Sultan after sultan attempts to reform or replace the Janissary corps, but each effort ends in failure or rebellion. The most serious attempt comes during the reign of Selim III in the late 18th century, when the Sultan tries to create a new European-style army called the New Order Troops. The Janissaries revolt, depose Selim, and massacre many of the new soldiers. Reform seems impossible as long as the Janissaries retain their political power. The final crisis comes during the reign of Mahmud II in the early 19th century. The empire faces external threats from Russia, internal rebellions in the Balkans and Egypt, and a complete breakdown of central authority. The Janissaries have become not just ineffective, but actively destructive, preventing any attempt at modernization or reform. Mahmud II spends years secretly preparing for a final confrontation with the Janissaries. He creates new military units loyal to him personally, builds alliances with religious authorities and civilian officials, and accumulates the political capital necessary for decisive action. He studies the tactics used by other rulers who successfully eliminated troublesome military castes, learning from both successes and failures. The end comes in June 1826, during what becomes known as the Auspicious Incident, when Mahmud II announces military reforms that would reduce Janissary privileges. The core rebels as expected. But this time the Sultan is ready. His loyal troops surround the Janissary barracks, supported by artillery and newly trained infantry units. Religious authorities issue proclamations supporting the Sultan and condemning the Janissaries as enemies of Islam and the state. The battle is swift and decisive. Loyal troops bombard the main Janissary barracks with cannon fire, then storm the buildings and massacre the defenders. Similar actions occur simultaneously across the empire as provincial governors, forewarned of the Sultan's plans, move against local Janissary units. Within days, the core that had dominated Ottoman politics for 2 centuries ceases to exist. The destruction of the Janissaries is thorough and systematic. Survivors are hunted down and executed. Their properties are confiscated. Their families are expelled from Istanbul. Even the name Janissary becomes forbidden, erased from official records and public memory. The institution that had once been the empire's greatest strength disappears as completely as if it had never existed. But the legacy of the Devshirme system and the Janissary core extends far beyond their violent end. For over 4 centuries, this institution had shaped Ottoman society, politics, and culture in profound ways. The system had taken hundreds of thousands of Christian children and transformed them into the builders and defenders of one of history's greatest empires. Many of the Ottoman Empire's most magnificent buildings were designed and constructed by former Janissaries. The architect Mimar Sinan, creator of the Süleymaniye Mosque and dozens of other masterpieces, was a Devshirme recruit from a Christian family in Anatolia. Grand Vizier Mehmed Sokollu, who ruled the empire for 15 years during its golden age, was taken as a boy from a Serbian village. Countless governors, judges, military commanders, and administrators rose from humble Christian origins to positions of ultimate power and responsibility. The system also created a unique form of social mobility that didn't exist elsewhere in the medieval or early modern world. While European societies remained rigidly stratified by birth, the Ottoman Empire offered paths to advancement based on merit and service. A peasant boy from the Balkans could, through the Devshirme system, rise to become the second most powerful person in an empire that stretched across 3 continents. This meritocratic element had profound effects on Ottoman culture and administration. The empire developed sophisticated bureaucratic systems, advanced educational institutions, and complex legal frameworks, largely because it could recruit talent from across its diverse population, rather than relying solely on hereditary elites. The forced integration of Christian youth into Islamic civilization created a synthesis of traditions that enriched Ottoman art, architecture, literature, and science. But the human cost of this system cannot be forgotten or minimized. Hundreds of thousands of families were destroyed by the Devshirme. Parents never recovered from the loss of their children. Communities lived in constant fear of the next collection. The psychological trauma inflicted on entire populations across southeastern Europe lasted for generations and left deep scars in collective memory. The children themselves, even those who rose to great heights, paid an enormous price for their success. They were cut off from their roots, alienated from their birth cultures, and forced to participate in the oppression of their own peoples. Many lived their entire lives struggling with questions of identity and belonging that had no easy answers. The system created brilliant administrators and fearless warriors, but it also produced human beings torn between multiple identities and conflicting loyalties. The religious dimension of the Devshirme adds another layer of complexity to its legacy. From an Islamic perspective, the conversion of Christian children could be seen as salvation, rescuing souls from spiritual darkness and bringing them into the community of believers. Many converts genuinely embraced their new faith and found meaning and purpose in Islamic civilization. But from a Christian perspective, the system represented a form of spiritual genocide. The systematic destruction of religious and cultural identity on a massive scale. The Devshirme also had profound effects on the Christian communities from which the children were taken. These populations developed complex strategies of resistance, accommodation, and survival that shaped their cultures for centuries. Some communities became more insular and traditional as they tried to protect their children and preserve their identities. Others became more collaborative with Ottoman authorities, seeking protection through cooperation rather than resistance. The system's impact on gender relations and family structures was equally significant. Christian families lived with the constant threat that their sons might be taken away, creating patterns of child-rearing and family planning designed to minimize this risk. Some families preferred daughters, seeing them as safer from Ottoman recruitment. Others sent their sons away to relatives in remote areas or arranged early marriages to make boys ineligible for selection. The end of the Devshirme system in the 17th century marked a turning point not just for the Ottoman military, but for the empire's entire social and political structure. Without the constant influx of converted Christian talent, the Ottoman bureaucracy became increasingly dominated by hereditary Turkish and Muslim families. This change reduced social mobility and made the empire's administration less dynamic and adaptable. The transformation also affected the empire's relationship with its Christian subjects. When Christians could no longer rise to high positions through conversion and military service, they became more marginalized within Ottoman society. This marginalization contributed to the growth of Christian nationalism in the 18th and 19th centuries. As communities that had once seen opportunity within the Ottoman system began to dream of independence from it. The story of the Devshirme and the Janissaries also illuminates broader questions about the nature of identity, loyalty, and belonging that remain relevant today. Can identity be completely transformed through systematic indoctrination and cultural pressure? Do people retain essential connections to their origins even after radical transformation? How do societies balance the need for unity and loyalty with respect for individual and community rights? The Ottoman example suggests that identity can indeed be transformed, sometimes completely, through sustained psychological and social pressure applied from childhood. Many Devshirme recruits genuinely became Ottoman Muslims who felt no connection to their Christian origins. But the system's ultimate failure also suggests that such transformations are fragile and may not survive changes in political and social conditions. The role of trauma in creating loyalty is another important dimension of the Devshirme system. The shared experience of abduction and forced conversion created powerful bonds between Janissaries that made them extraordinarily effective as a military unit. But trauma-based loyalty proved to be unstable over time, eventually turning into resentment and rebellion when conditions changed. Modern discussions of child soldiers often reference the Ottoman Devshirme as a historical precedent, but the comparison requires careful analysis. Contemporary child soldiers are typically recruited during periods of chaos and conflict, receive minimal training, and are used as expendable troops in irregular warfare. The Ottoman system, by contrast, was systematic, bureaucratic, and designed to create an elite force through extensive training and education. The Devshirme was also embedded in a sophisticated legal and religious framework that provided justification and regulation for the practice. Islamic law permitted the enslavement of prisoners taken in war against non-Muslims, and Ottoman jurists developed elaborate theological arguments for why the Devshirme served both imperial and religious purposes. Modern child soldier recruitment typically lacks any comparable legal or ideological framework. However, both systems share the fundamental characteristic of exploiting children's psychological vulnerability to create loyal fighters willing to serve causes they didn't choose. Both demonstrate how systematic indoctrination can overcome natural family loyalties and cultural attachments. And both show how military organizations can use trauma and isolation to create intense unit cohesion and unquestioning obedience. The technological and social changes that made the Janissary system obsolete offer insights into how military institutions adapt to changing conditions. The Janissaries' emphasis on traditional weapons and tactics made sense in the context of 16th century warfare, but became a liability as European armies adopted new technologies and strategies. Their resistance to change reflected not just conservatism, but rational self-interest, as modernization threatened their privileged position within Ottoman society. This dynamic appears repeatedly in military history, as elite units struggle to maintain their relevance and privileges in the face of technological and social change. The challenge facing military organizations is how to maintain the esprit de corps and institutional loyalty that make them effective while remaining adaptable enough to evolve with changing conditions. The Janissary system also demonstrates how military institutions can become political actors with their own agendas that may conflict with broader state interests. The corps that began as the Sultan's personal slaves ended up as kingmakers who could make or break imperial policy. This transformation reflects the inherent tension between creating military units loyal enough to be trusted with weapons and power, while preventing them from using that power against the state they serve. The broader lessons of the Devshirme system extend beyond military affairs to questions of governance, social integration, and empire building. The Ottoman Empire's ability to incorporate diverse populations and harness their talents was one of its greatest strengths during its period of expansion and consolidation. The systematic recruitment and training of talent from across the empire's territories created administrative capacity and military effectiveness that few other states could match. But the system's reliance on coercion and cultural destruction also created long-term instabilities that contributed to the empire's eventual decline. The communities subjected to the Devshirme never fully reconciled themselves to Ottoman rule, and the resentments generated by the system helped fuel the nationalist movements that eventually dismantled the empire. The Devshirme experience also shaped European perceptions of the Ottoman Empire in ways that influenced diplomatic and military relations for centuries. European observers were simultaneously fascinated and horrified by a system that could transform Christian peasant boys into Islamic warriors and administrators. This fascination contributed to Orientalist stereotypes that portrayed Ottoman society as simultaneously magnificent and barbaric, disciplined and despotic. These European perceptions weren't entirely inaccurate, but they often missed the complexity and contradictions inherent in the Ottoman system. The same institution that committed what we would now recognize as cultural genocide against Christian children also created opportunities for advancement and achievement that were unavailable in European societies of the same period. The empire that systematically destroyed family bonds also created new forms of brotherhood and solidarity that many participants found meaningful and fulfilling. As we reflect on this history, it's important to avoid both romantic idealization and simplistic condemnation of the Devshirme system. The Ottoman Empire's achievements in art, architecture, administration, and military affairs were built partly on the talents of men who had been torn from their families as children and forced to adopt new identities. These achievements are real and significant, but they came at an enormous human cost that cannot be ignored or justified. The story of young Nicola, who became Mehmet the Janissary, encapsulates both the tragedy and the complexity of this system. He lost his family, his religion, his culture, and his name. But he may have gained opportunities, experiences, and achievements that would have been impossible in his original life as a Serbian peasant. He might have risen to become a provincial governor, a master architect, or a military commander whose decisions shaped the lives of millions. We can't know whether Mehmet ever regretted the transformation that took him from a shepherd's hut to an imperial palace, or whether he ever wondered what his life might have been if the recruiters had never come to his village. What we do know is that his story, multiplied by hundreds of thousands, created one of history's most remarkable military institutions and helped build one of its greatest empires. The legacy of the Devshirme and the Janissaries reminds us that history is never simple, that great achievements often come at terrible costs, and that human beings have an extraordinary capacity to adapt to even the most extreme circumstances. It challenges us to think carefully about the relationship between individual rights and collective goals, between cultural preservation and social mobility, between loyalty and freedom. Today, as we grapple with questions of immigration, integration, and identity in our own societies, the Ottoman experience offers both warnings and insights. It shows how systematic programs of cultural transformation can succeed in creating new identities and loyalties, but also how such programs can generate long-term resentments and instabilities. It demonstrates the potential benefits of merit-based advancement systems, while illustrating the dangers of institutions that become too powerful to control. The Devshirme system was a product of its time, shaped by medieval concepts of warfare, slavery, and religious obligation that we now reject. But the human dynamics it reveals, the malleability of identity, the power of institutional loyalty, the tension between individual rights and collective needs, remain relevant to contemporary debates about military service, social integration, and national identity. The 8-year-old boy who was torn from his family in a Serbian village became part of a system that shaped the course of world history for 4 centuries. His individual tragedy was multiplied hundreds of thousands of times, but those individual tragedies also created collective achievements that still inspire wonder and admiration today. The Janissaries were both victims and perpetrators, slaves and masters, destroyers and creators. Their story reminds us that history is written not just by kings and generals, but by ordinary people caught up in extraordinary circumstances, people who find ways to survive, adapt, and sometimes thrive even under the most difficult conditions. The Devshirme child soldiers of the Ottoman Empire were products of a system we now recognize as fundamentally unjust. But they were also human beings who made choices, formed relationships, and created meaning within the constraints imposed upon them. In the end, the Janissaries were destroyed by the same forces that created them: the need for military effectiveness and political stability. When they ceased to serve these purposes and instead became obstacles to them, they were swept away as ruthlessly as they had once swept away the empire's enemies. The institution that had seemed permanent and invincible proved to be as mortal as the men who served within it. But their legacy endures in the magnificent buildings they constructed, the administrative systems they created, and the historical memory of their extraordinary transformation from Christian peasant boys into Islamic warrior scholars. They remind us that human identity is more fluid than we often assume, that loyalty can be created as well as inherited, and that even the most powerful institutions are ultimately vulnerable to the forces of historical change. The story of the Devshirme and the Janissaries is ultimately a story about power, how it's created, maintained, and lost. It shows how a state can harness human resources through systematic coercion and indoctrination, but also how such systems create their own contradictions and limitations. The very success of the Janissary system contained the seeds of its eventual destruction, as privileged slaves became powerful masters who forgot their origins and pursued their own interests above those of the empire they were created to serve. This pattern of institutions becoming powerful enough to challenge the authorities that created them appears repeatedly throughout history and continues to shape contemporary politics and society. The Devshirme system offers a particularly dramatic example of how such dynamics can play out over centuries, creating and destroying some of history's most formidable military and political institutions. As we close this examination of one of history's most controversial military systems, we're left with questions that have no easy answers. Was the Devshirme system a form of genocide, an opportunity for advancement, or both? Were the Janissaries victims of oppression, beneficiaries of privilege, or simultaneously both? Can we condemn a system that produced great art and architecture while destroying families and cultures? How do we balance historical understanding with moral judgment? These questions matter not just for understanding the Ottoman past, but for engaging with our contemporary world, where questions of identity, loyalty, integration, and opportunity continue to shape individual lives and collective destinies. The 8-year-old boy who became a Janissary reminds us that behind every historical system, no matter how grand or terrible, are individual human beings trying to make sense of their circumstances and create meaningful lives within the constraints imposed upon them. The Devshirme child soldiers of the Ottoman Empire were both the products and the creators of one of history's most remarkable civilizations. But their story didn't end with the massacre of 1826. The echoes of their existence would reverberate through the dying Ottoman Empire and into the modern world in ways that few could have predicted. In the immediate aftermath of the auspicious incident, Sultan Mahmud II faced a crisis that went far beyond military reorganization. The destruction of the Janissaries had eliminated not just a military force, but an entire social and administrative class that had governed the empire for centuries. Provincial governors, tax collectors, judges, and engineers, many of whom were former Janissaries or connected to the core, suddenly found themselves without institutional protection or clear authority. The vacuum left by the Janissaries' destruction created opportunities for new power centers to emerge. Local strongmen, tribal leaders, and wealthy merchants rushed to fill the void left by Ottoman central authority. In Egypt, Mehmed Ali Pasha, himself a product of the Ottoman military system, began building an independent power base that would soon challenge Istanbul directly. In the Balkans, Serbian and Greek revolutionaries found their Ottoman opponents suddenly weakened and demoralized. But perhaps the most immediate crisis was administrative. The Janissaries hadn't just been soldiers, they had been the empire's primary pool of trained administrators and technical experts. Their elimination left the Ottoman government desperately short of qualified personnel to run provincial governments, collect taxes, and maintain infrastructure. Mahmud II found himself trying to rebuild not just a military force, but an entire governing system. The Sultan's solution was to look westward for both military models and technical expertise. European military advisors arrived in Istanbul to train the new Ottoman army according to modern European standards. French and Prussian officers taught artillery tactics. Austrian engineers designed new fortifications, and British naval experts advised on fleet modernization. For the first time in centuries, the Ottoman Empire explicitly acknowledged that it had fallen behind European military technology and needed to catch up. This acknowledgement marked a fundamental shift in Ottoman self-perception. The empire that had once seen itself as the leader of Islamic civilization and the inheritor of Roman greatness now recognized its secondary status in the emerging modern world order. The psychological impact of this realization extended far beyond military affairs to reshape Ottoman culture, education, and politics. The new army created to replace the Janissaries was organized along European lines, with European-style uniforms, weapons, and training. But recruiting soldiers for this force proved more difficult than expected. Turkish and Muslim populations, who had been exempt from military service for centuries, showed little enthusiasm for the rigorous discipline and extended service terms of modern European armies. Many preferred traditional forms of military service or avoided military obligations altogether. The government responded by implementing conscription for the first time in Ottoman history. All Muslim men became liable for military service, fundamentally altering the relationship between the state and its Muslim subjects. This change broke down the traditional distinction between the military class, askeri, and the tax-paying class, reaya, that had structured Ottoman society for centuries. But conscription faced massive resistance from populations unaccustomed to such obligations. Peasant families hid their sons, bribed officials, or arranged emigration to avoid military service. Some regions erupted in open rebellion against the new requirements. The empire that had once relied on foreign child soldiers now struggled to recruit willing soldiers from its own Muslim population. The resistance to conscription revealed deeper problems with the post-Janissary military system. The Devshirme had worked partly because it drew from populations with no political voice or institutional protection. Christian peasants couldn't effectively resist the Sultan's demands because they lacked representation in Ottoman governing structures. But Muslim, Turkish, and Arab populations had traditional rights and expectations that made them more difficult to coerce into military service. Meanwhile, the destruction of the Janissaries had eliminated the empire's most effective intelligence and police network. The corps had maintained order in major cities, monitored political opposition, and suppressed rebellions before they could spread. Without this system, the Ottoman government found itself increasingly unable to maintain internal security or respond effectively to local challenges. The timing of the Janissaries' destruction proved particularly unfortunate. The 1820s and 1830s were periods of intense nationalist agitation throughout southeastern Europe. Greek revolutionaries declared independence in 1821, launching a war that would eventually establish the first successful Christian nation-state to emerge from Ottoman territory. Serbian autonomy movements gained momentum. Bulgarian and Romanian intellectuals began developing national consciousness and political organizations. In previous centuries, Janissary units would have been deployed to suppress these movements before they could gain momentum. The corps' multi-ethnic composition and lack of local loyalties made them ideal for such missions. But the new Ottoman army, recruited from Turkish populations, proved less reliable when deployed against Christian nationalist movements that enjoyed some popular support. The Greek War of Independence, in particular, exposed the military and political consequences of destroying the Janissaries. Ottoman forces, commanded by inexperienced officers and consisting of poorly trained conscripts, suffered repeated defeats against Greek irregulars and European volunteers. The empire that had once terrified Christian Europe now required Egyptian military assistance to suppress a rebellion in one of its core provinces. European public opinion, inflamed by romantic Philhellenism and reports of Ottoman atrocities, turned decisively against the empire. The Battle of Navarino in 1827, where British, French, and Russian fleets destroyed the Ottoman Egyptian navy, demonstrated that European powers no longer feared Ottoman military retaliation. The empire had become a victim rather than a threat. The Greek crisis also revealed how the elimination of the Janissaries had affected Ottoman diplomacy and international relations. For centuries, European ambassadors had negotiated with Ottoman officials who were products of the Devshirme system, men who combined Islamic education with practical knowledge of European languages, customs, and politics. These officials understood both Ottoman and European perspectives and could navigate complex diplomatic situations. The new Ottoman diplomatic corps, recruited from traditional Turkish families, lacked this cross-cultural sophistication. They often misunderstood European intentions, failed to appreciate the importance of public opinion in European politics, and made strategic miscalculations that isolated the empire internationally. The diplomatic skills that had once made Ottoman negotiators formidable adversaries declined along with military effectiveness. But the most profound impact of the Janissaries' destruction was cultural and intellectual. The corps had been a crucial link between Islamic civilization and the broader world. Janissary officers had translated European military manuals, studied foreign languages, and maintained correspondence with international scholars. They had been cosmopolitan in outlook and pragmatic in approach, willing to adopt useful innovations regardless of their origins. The elimination of this intellectual class left Ottoman culture more insular and conservative. Traditional religious scholars, ulema, gained influence at the expense of practically minded administrators. Educational institutions focused more narrowly on classical Islamic subjects and paid less attention to modern sciences and technologies. The empire that had once been intellectually curious and adaptable became increasingly rigid and backward-looking. This cultural shift had immediate practical consequences for Ottoman military modernization. European military advisors found that their Ottoman counterparts often lacked the mathematical and scientific knowledge necessary to understand modern artillery, engineering, and logistics. Educational institutions that had once produced sophisticated administrators and military commanders now graduated students unprepared for the technical demands of 19th century governance and warfare. The government attempted to address these problems by establishing new educational institutions modeled on European schools. Military academies, medical schools, and engineering colleges were founded with European curricula and often European instructors. But these institutions faced resistance from traditional educational establishments and religious authorities who saw them as threats to Islamic values and Ottoman traditions. The students who graduated from these new institutions found themselves caught between two worlds. They had been educated in European methods and ideas, but lived in a society that remained largely traditional and Islamic. Many became advocates for further westernization and modernization, creating a new class of Ottoman intellectuals who looked to Europe for models of political and social organization. This westernizing intellectual movement, which would later be known as the Tanzimat, reorganization, represented a complete reversal of traditional Ottoman cultural attitudes. For centuries, Ottoman elites had seen their civilization as superior to Christian Europe and had adopted European innovations only when they proved militarily or administratively useful. Now, Ottoman intellectuals began to argue that European civilization was fundamentally superior and that Ottoman society needed comprehensive reform along European lines. The irony was profound. The Devshirme system had originally been designed to protect Ottoman Islamic civilization by incorporating useful elements from Christian Europe while maintaining Islamic dominance. The Janissaries, as converted Christians, had served as a buffer between Islamic Ottoman culture and potentially corrupting European influences. Their elimination removed this buffer and exposed Ottoman culture directly to European ideas and values. The new Ottoman military officers, trained by European advisors and educated in European methods, began to see themselves as agents of modernization and westernization. Unlike the Janissaries, who had been socialized into traditional Ottoman Islamic culture, these officers identified with European military professionalism and political ideas. They would eventually become the driving force behind the Young Turk movement and the constitutional revolution of 1908. Meanwhile, the Christian populations from which the Devshirme had once recruited were developing their own responses to the changed situation. The end of the child tribute eliminated one of their primary grievances against Ottoman rule, but it also removed their main avenue for advancement within the imperial system. Christian families no longer faced the trauma of losing their sons, but they also lost the possibility that those sons might rise to positions of power and influence. This change had complex effects on Ottoman Christian communities. Some welcomed the end of what they had always seen as a form of cultural genocide. Others recognized that the Devshirme, despite its brutality, had provided opportunities for social mobility that were now permanently closed. The system's elimination made Christian subjects more secure in their families and communities, but also more marginal to the empire's governing structures. As nationalist movements gained momentum throughout the 19th century, the memory of the Devshirme became a powerful symbol of Ottoman oppression. Greek, Serbian, Bulgarian, and Albanian nationalist writers portrayed the system as evidence of Ottoman barbarism and used it to justify demands for independence. The child soldiers who had once served as symbols of Ottoman power became martyrs in the nationalist narratives of Ottoman successor states. But the reality was more complicated than these nationalist narratives suggested. Many of the buildings, institutions, and cultural achievements that nationalist movements claimed as their own heritage had been created by men who were products of the Devshirme system. The magnificent mosques, bridges, and public buildings that graced Balkan cities had often been commissioned by Ottoman governors and administrators who had been taken as Christian children and raised as Muslim Ottoman elites. This created uncomfortable contradictions for nationalist historians and politicians. How could they simultaneously condemn the Devshirme system and celebrate the achievements of men who had been products of that system? How could they claim buildings and institutions created by converted Christians as part of their authentic national heritage while denouncing the system that had made such achievements possible? Some nationalist movements resolved this contradiction by developing theories of crypto-Christianity. The idea that converted Ottoman officials had secretly maintained their Christian faith and ethnic identity despite outward conformity to Islam. These theories, though historically unsupported, allowed nationalist writers to reclaim successful Ottoman officials as members of their own communities while still condemning the system that had produced them. The Ottoman government, struggling to maintain the loyalty of its remaining Christian subjects, found itself caught between competing narratives about the Devshirme system's legacy. Officials couldn't defend the system without appearing to endorse what was increasingly seen as a violation of human rights and religious freedom. But they also couldn't completely condemn it without implicitly criticizing the entire Ottoman historical tradition and the achievements of many of the empire's greatest leaders. This historical embarrassment contributed to the Ottoman government's increasing emphasis on Turkish and Islamic identity rather than the multi-ethnic, multi-religious Ottoman identity that had characterized the empire during its classical period. If the Devshirme system represented a shameful aberration rather than a source of pride, then Ottoman legitimacy had to be based on other foundations. The emergence of Turkish nationalism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was partly a response to this historical and ideological crisis. Turkish intellectuals began to argue that the Ottoman Empire's greatest achievements had come from Turkish rather than converted Christian leadership. They minimized the role of Devshirme recruits in Ottoman history and emphasized instead the contributions of Turkish military commanders, administrators, and cultural figures. This Turkish nationalist reinterpretation of Ottoman history had the ironic effect of diminishing the very achievements that had made the empire great. The sophisticated administrative systems, magnificent architectural projects, and military innovations that had been created through the systematic recruitment and training of talent from across the empire were reattributed to a narrower Turkish elite that had actually played a smaller role in these accomplishments. The Young Turk Revolution of 1908, which established constitutional government in the Ottoman Empire, represented the triumph of this new Turkish nationalist perspective. The revolution was led by military officers who saw themselves as heirs to a European military tradition rather than to the Ottoman Janissary legacy. They viewed the empire's multi-ethnic past as a source of weakness rather than strength, and sought to create a more homogeneous Turkish nation-state. The genocide of Armenian, Greek, and Assyrian Christians during World War I can be understood partly as the final rejection of the Ottoman Empire's multi-ethnic tradition. The system that had once systematically recruited Christian children and converted them into Ottoman elites was replaced by policies designed to eliminate Christian populations entirely. The empire that had built its strength on diversity ended by trying to achieve security through ethnic homogeneity. When the Ottoman Empire finally collapsed after World War I, its successor state, the Republic of Turkey, explicitly rejected the imperial Ottoman tradition. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk and his followers portrayed the Ottoman Empire as a backward, theocratic anachronism that had held back Turkish development. They adopted European models of nationalism, secularism, and modernization, while rejecting the multi-ethnic Islamic imperial tradition that had characterized Ottoman civilization. The Devshirme system and the Janissary core were forgotten or actively suppressed in the new Turkish national narrative. Textbooks that mentioned them at all portrayed them as examples of Ottoman backwardness and oppression. The system that had once been a source of imperial pride became an embarrassment to be minimized or ignored. But in the Balkan successor states, the memory of the Devshirme system took on different meanings. Greek, Serbian, Bulgarian, and Albanian historians incorporated the blood tax into national narratives of suffering and resistance. The system became evidence of Ottoman barbarism and justification for the nationalist movements that had created independent nation-states. These competing national narratives obscured the historical complexity of the Devshirme system and its role in creating one of history's most successful multi-ethnic empires. The system had indeed caused enormous suffering and violated what we now recognize as fundamental human rights. But it had also created opportunities for advancement and achievement that were remarkable for their historical period. The modern states that emerged from Ottoman territory struggled to match the administrative sophistication and cultural achievement of the empire they had replaced. The merit-based system that had recruited talent from across the empire's territories was replaced by nationalist bureaucracies that drew from much smaller talent pools. The cosmopolitan outlook that had characterized Ottoman elites gave way to narrower national perspectives that were often hostile to minority populations and foreign influences. Contemporary scholars have begun to reassess the Devshirme system and its role in Ottoman history with greater nuance and complexity. They recognize both its traumatic impact on affected communities and its importance in creating the administrative and military structures that made Ottoman greatness possible. This scholarship has revealed how the system served as a form of social engineering that created loyalty, competence, and cultural synthesis on a scale unprecedented in medieval and early modern history. The Devshirme system also offers insights into contemporary debates about military service, social integration, and national identity. Modern militaries continue to struggle with questions about how to create unit cohesion and institutional loyalty while maintaining democratic civilian control. The Ottoman experience suggests both the potential and the dangers of creating military institutions with strong esprit de corps and institutional autonomy. The system's emphasis on merit-based advancement and systematic training also resonates with contemporary discussions about social mobility and educational opportunity. While the coercive methods used by the Ottomans are unacceptable by modern standards, the principle of identifying and developing talent, regardless of social origin, remains relevant to contemporary policy debates. Perhaps most importantly, the Devshirme system illustrates both the possibilities and the limitations of using systematic indoctrination to create new identities and loyalties. The Ottoman success in transforming Christian peasant children into Muslim Ottoman elites demonstrates the malleability of human identity under certain conditions. But the system's ultimate failure suggests that such transformations may be inherently unstable and vulnerable to changing circumstances. The legacy of the child soldiers, who became the Ottoman Empire's greatest strength and ultimate weakness, continues to influence the modern Middle East and Balkans. The administrative traditions, architectural achievements, and cultural syntheses they created survive in museums, monuments, and institutional practices throughout the former Ottoman territories. The trauma they inflicted on Christian communities contributed to the nationalist movements that eventually dismantled the empire and created the contemporary political map of southeastern Europe and the Middle East. Their story reminds us that historical judgment must account for both human costs and historical achievements, both individual suffering and collective accomplishments. The 8-year-old boy who was taken from his Serbian village and transformed into a Janissary represents millions of individuals whose personal tragedies contributed to historical transformations that shape the world we inhabit today. In our own era of global migration, cultural integration, and identity politics, the Ottoman Devshirme system offers both warnings and insights about the possibilities and dangers of systematic efforts to reshape human communities and identities. It shows how states can harness human diversity for collective purposes, while also demonstrating the ultimate fragility of systems based on coercion rather than consent. The Janissaries who rose from Christian peasant boys to become the architects of empire remind us that human potential can flourish under the most unlikely circumstances, but also that such flourishing comes at costs that must be honestly acknowledged and carefully weighed. Their legacy challenges us to think more deeply about the relationship between individual freedom and collective achievement, between cultural preservation and social mobility, between the demands of the state and the rights of the family. As we continue to grapple with questions of immigration, integration, military service, and national identity in our own societies, the Ottoman experience offers a sobering reminder that there are no easy answers to these fundamental challenges of human organization. The Devshirme child soldiers achieved remarkable things and paid terrible prices for their achievements. Their story, in all its complexity and contradiction, remains relevant to anyone trying to understand how human societies can harness diversity for collective purposes while respecting individual dignity and community rights. The boy who was taken from his family at age 8 and transformed into an imperial administrator reminds us that history is made by individual human beings caught up in systems larger than themselves. People who find ways to survive, adapt, and sometimes thrive even under the most difficult circumstances. His story, multiplied by hundreds of thousands, created and destroyed one of history's greatest empires. It continues to echo through the modern world, shaping our understanding of identity, loyalty, power, and the eternal human struggle to balance individual rights with collective needs.